Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are going to hear about the book Theorising Heterosexuality, edited by Diane Richardson, and it's being discussed by Sheila Jeffries and Julia Long. So welcome, Sheila and Julia, and over to you.
Thanks, Joe. So good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's a beautiful morning over here in England. It's a really lovely spring morning. So we are going to be talking about this text that you can see on the screen, Theorising Heterosexuality, which is a collection edited by Diane Richardson. Sheila's going to be introducing the book, but if I'll just do an overview to begin with so you can see where we're going with the Joe, if I can have that overview slide, please. So you can see what we're going to be covering in the in this webinar. So as I say, Sheila's going to be introducing the book and introducing the debates that it addresses more widely. I'll just be responding briefly to that. And then in terms of engaging with the content of the book, Sheila's going to be talking about chapter 1, which is a chapter by Diane Richardson on heterosexuality and social theory. I'm going to be, it does look quite heavily theoretical, which it is, but we'll try and make it as digestible as we can for you. I'm going to be talking about the second chapter, which is by Stevie Jackson, Heterosexuality and Feminist Theory. Then it'll be back to Sheila to talk about her own chapter in the book, Heterosexuality and the Desire for Gender. I'm then going to be talking about a chapter of that was drawn from a big qualitative study in the sort of late 80s, early 90s about young heterosexual people's experience of first heterosex, called In the Same Boat. And then I'm going to be handing back to Sheila. Hopefully we'll have time for both of these to say a bit about chapter 6, which is by Wendy Holway, Recognition and Heterosexual Desire, and then chapter 8, which is by Tamsin Wilton, Which One's the Man? The Heterosexualization of Lesbian Sex. So we've got quite a lot to cover, and I'll hand straight over to Sheila to introduce the book.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Julia. Somebody just said in the chat, have we done this book before? And no, we haven't, but we've done a book before called Heterosexuality, a Reader by Celia Kitzinger and Sue Wilkinson, which is a much more interesting book in the way that it's written and much more accessible than this one. So the first thing really that I want to say today is that I'm not advising you to buy this book, which, by the way, is from 1996. And it was a very important time. Because usually I say, oh, you know, this is a really good book and you'll enjoy it. I don't think you will. It's very highly theoretical. It's quite hard to read. And for that reason, it isn't hugely interesting. But it is historically really interesting. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now, because it's interesting for what it tells about what feminists and lesbian feminists in particular were thinking about this really important topic 30 years ago. So the book comes from a very, very different time from now. In 1996, when the book came out, it was normal in feminist academia to question heterosexuality as a political institution. Imagine that. Imagine that. It is unimaginable now. The book contains both heterosexual and lesbian feminist theorists, all of whom understood that sexuality and heterosexuality were socially constructed and formed a vital part, if not the absolute foundation, of the oppression of women. Nobody was arguing for biology. The main authors were radical, or in my case, revolutionary feminists, but some were not, as you will see, as we talk about the book. It's very hard to imagine this now. My book was a significant part of the theorizing of heterosexuality. My work was a significant part of the theorizing of heterosexuality and feminism, which began in the 1970s in the US and in the UK, with lesbian feminists such as the group Leeds Revolutionary Feminists that I was part of, with the Political Lesbianism paper in 1979, and Adrienne Rich and her paper, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence in 1980, and this work was revolutionary. Before the feminist revolution in critical thinking and ways of living in the 1970s, the dominant way of thinking was that sexual orientation was biological, and lesbianism and male homosexuality were simply the perverse activities of sexual deviance from the natural, the normal, the God-given, the inevitable, which was heterosexuality. Now, heterosexuality couldn't be theorized until there was a word for it. And when I taught my week of lectures on heterosexuality at Melbourne Uni in the 90s and the early 2000s, I used to start off by explaining that heterosexuality couldn't be thought about until there was a word to describe the phenomenon. My Oxford Dictionary from when I was at school in 1964 didn't include the words heterosexual or heterosexuality. The much bigger two-book edition was that I had for my birthday present in 1998, when I was 40 years old. That didn't have those words either, and that edition, though, was for a bit earlier. Now, the words seem to have entered the Oxford Dictionary, which is sort of the byword in Britain, in 1989. Now, that seems now it seems pretty recent. And of course it was, because of course feminists were using it and talking about it. And indeed, I was teaching and using those words just a couple of years after it got into the dictionary. So we were using it, but other people could not conceptualize the word. It wasn't out there for them even to think about. So heterosexuality couldn't be separated from the self and described as a phenomenon. By the time this book was published in 1996, there was a great deal of theory available, and feminists were very familiar with both the word and the concept. But, sad to say, the theory and practice which feminists had developed by then is pretty much all gone now. The theorizing after Adrienne Rich's important paper was mostly done in the UK, and there was an outburst of work in the early 1990s, of which my book, Anticlimax, in 1990 was a very important part, quite a foundational part, I think. By the late 90s, this burst of theoretical activity was over, and I became aware that the problematizing of heterosexuality, which we thought was just beginning, had only had a brief flowering, and that was it. It was over pretty much. We thought it was really going to be extended to everything and all areas of life, and there was going to be this extraordinary development of theory. That never happened. It was stopped by a backlash against feminism. By the mid-90s, what were called the feminist sex wars had done huge harm to the women's liberation movement and to feminist culture and politics. At the same time as some feminist academics in the UK were advancing the theorizing of heterosexuality, we were also developing the understanding that sexuality under male domination was created out of the eroticizing of women's subordination, which of course is what I argued in Anticlimax. Now, all of this work that we were doing was hugely threatening to the sexual regime of male domination and was met with a backlash, which consisted of a huge pornographizing of lesbianism through a cult of lesbian sadomasochism. And in the early 1990s, queer politics developed, which supported the romanticizing of gender or fetishized masculinity and femininity. And that's spurred an upsurge in butch femme role-playing and transgenderism. And the politics of gender identity developed, and many lesbians in the US started to play with drag kinging and becoming male impersonators, with or without the self-mutilation of surgery on hormones. So this time in the late 90s was a time of grief for feminists and lesbian feminists as we saw our movement dying. But 1996 was still a very fertile time, but it was an end time. So let's go over to Julia.
Thanks, Sheila. That's really interesting. I see some people are commenting in the chat about the dates of the entry of the term into the dictionary. So I think that's really interesting, isn't it? When certain things become, that's one of the things that they talk about in the book, about when certain things, heterosexuality becomes visible, and there you can talk about it and critique it, in a way that you can't before there's a term for it. And I do remember myself actually looking for the term transgenderism, and it wasn't in the dictionaries in the sort of 1990s. So I think that's always a really interesting exercise to do. So I know with these webinars, we usually talk about when we first read the book. And as I was saying to you previously, Sheila, I really, on this occasion, I think this is the first time I really can't particularly remember even when I read. Well, I know when I got it, it was quite a while after it was probably about 20 years after it was published. I got it when I was teaching, and I think I just had such a heavy teaching workload then. I was racing through books and to plan my lectures and things. So I don't particularly remember it making a huge impression on me at the time, but I did just want to mention that another book that I had that was co-edited by Diane Richardson with someone called Victoria Robinson was a book called Introducing Women's Studies, and that was something that I really used a lot. I think I got that in about 1990, and I found it really helpful with teaching and just sort of generally. So I thought I'd just share this anecdote because I think it nicely shows the sort of the way that things went. So that book was called Introducing Women's Studies, and it was sort of a classic women's studies collection of its time, talking about education, employment, all these different sort of topics. And then when I was teaching sort of in the 2010s, I think it would have been about 2014, 2015, I was sent a copy of the fourth edition of this Introducing Women's Studies, which I have here, which is always a bit hard to... I can't really see, it's a bit blurry, but anyway, by now it was still this, it's the an updated version. By now it was introducing gender and women's studies, so they'd introduced the term gender into it, and there was an essay, among other things. There was a chapter in it by Sally Hines, who we know is a huge sort of cheerleader for transgenderism. And in that, she refers to TERFs, and the fact that something like that could be included in this collection just seems to me very, a very sort of good illustration of the way that things had gone. The fact that these editors felt that was suitable to be included. So I wanted to just share that really, rather than the thoughts about the particular text. So I'll hand back to you, Sheila, to talk about the first chapter.
Thanks very much, Julia. Now, I'm going to look at Diane Richardson, the editor's for chapter first. I didn't know Diane in person in those days, or indeed any of the other theorists who are in this book. But what I do remember of her is that she very kindly phoned me at my flat in Putney back in the 1980s to tell me that a lesbian sex shop, which had been set up in London, was selling a dildo called in their catalogue, the Sheila, the Spinster's Best Friend. It was named after my first book, The Spinster and Her Enemies, which was published in 1985. So I did know that she was a lesbian feminist of similar politics from that interaction. Now, the sex business and the lesbian sex business at that time obviously thought it was a funny title, because they knew I was critical of the idea that lesbian sexuality should be based on the use of an implement that represented the penis. I mean, at that time, not just me, but other lesbian feminists in general were all discussing lesbian practice and how it should be, and how different it should be, and how it should overthrow all the rules of male-dominant sexuality. So I would sometimes argue about this at conferences because there were a lot of dildos on sale. And I would say that I didn't really think that use of penises that looked like, dildos that looked like penises were a good idea. And I would also say things like I disapproved of blunt instruments generally, because hands and fingers are very sensitive, whereas penis substitutes are potentially damaging of the cervix, and did represent the heterosexualization of lesbian sex. So I wasn't anti-penetration, which is sometimes how I was described at the time, but dildos shaped like penises I thought were problematic. So of course they thought this was hilarious, and the lesbian sex shop decided they would make fun of me and the politics that we were developing at the time. So can I have the first slide, Joe? So this is Diane's first chapter. I think it's a good chapter. She's doing a lesbian feminist analysis, basically, of how we need to theorize heterosexuality. And she says that within social and political theory, little attention has traditionally been given to theorizing heterosexuality. Instead, most of the conceptual frameworks we use to theorize human relations rely implicitly upon a naturalized heterosexuality, whether these are, of course, sociology or anthropology or history or whatever it is. And she says that more recently, there have been significant attempts by both feminists and proponents of queer theory, because queer theory was just starting to come in at this point, to interrogate the way that heterosexuality encodes and structures everyday life, and to recognize the impact that ignoring or excluding heterosexuality had on the development of social theory. In fact, of course, queer theory never really included feminism, was not about a feminist critique of heterosexuality. And that pretty much faded out. I mean, queer now, of course, just means everybody who thinks their particular sexual practice, whether they're heterosexual or what they are, is a little bit unusual. So this sort of critical nature of queer theory died reasonably quickly. But yes, there was a general understanding developing within feminist theory in particular that we needed to criticize heterosexuality. And if we go on to the next slide, the next slide is about Diane defining heteronormativity. We were developing all kinds of language about heteropatriarchy, heteronormativity, language which showed that we understood that heterosexuality was political, a political system, and so on. And heteronormativity, she said, is how the way in which heterosexuality is institutionalized as a particular form of practice and relationships, of family structure and identity, constructed as a coherent, natural, fixed, and stable category, as universal and monolithic. And that is what we were trying to get understood at the time. Now, if we can go take that slide away, Joe, thank you. Now, one thing that surprised me when I went back to read this book, and I think I hadn't read it very thoroughly at the time, is the extent to which the authors are to a large extent arguing with me and the many revolutionary feminists who, though they might be developing these ideas, many of us were not academics and had not written them down. I did write them down. And my and our position was that lesbianism was being heterosexualized through what I called at that time putting the power back in. We talked about how, because we were trying to create a new kind of lesbianism, lesbians were in this wonderful position that there was not an immediate power relationship between lesbians. In theory, we had a level of power because we were all women relating to each other, whereas in heterosexuality, of course, men and women relate to each other in a world which is entirely constructed about the eroticizing of the difference between men and women. So, of course, it's not possible for men or women within heterosexuality to avoid in some way confronting the problem that power is deeply embedded in the relation between them. So lesbians were in this fortunate position of, in theory, being able to relate to each other in a way in which we could have complete respect for and the equality between our sovereign selves, as it were. Now, that was seen as a problem by some lesbians at the time, because their desire for each other was constructed, or their sexuality generally was constructed around eroticizing dominance and submission. And they found relating to other women lacked the buzz of power difference, the buzz of cruelty, I would call it in the end, because I do think that's what the power difference is about. So without the buzz of cruelty, the buzz of power difference, they would find sex between lesbians based on equality about, as I used to call it back in the 1980s, about as exciting as a cold rice pudding, because they just couldn't imagine how that could be exciting. Since sex was about power difference, what could you do? What could you do, really? And so, for many lesbians at the time, not lesbian feminists, but women who'd been lesbians generally, outside, many of whom had been in the sex industry, many of whom were involved in the mid-80s, in the beginnings of creating a lesbian pornography industry and so on. For many of them, it was important to create what they a cult of sadomasochism. So you put the power back in through sadomasochism, or you put the power back in through butch and femme role-playing. But one way or another, you had to heterosexualize lesbianism by putting the power back in so that the buzz of excitement of difference of power could make lesbianism exciting. So if we could just go on to the next slide. I think we're on to...
Yep. So this is over to me. Are you finished on that chapter now, Sheila? Is it
I've finished that chapter.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Thanks. So it's over to me. So I think this follows on sort of quite nicely from what you were saying there. So this second chapter is it kind of extends the first one. The first one's about heterosexuality and social theory. This is about heterosexuality and feminist theory. It's by Stevie Jackson, who opens the chapter by acknowledging that she is a heterosexual feminist. And what she says at the beginning of the chapter is she acknowledges the debates that Sheila was just referencing there. The resurgence of interest in heterosexuality among feminists has occurred in the context of more than 2 decades in which the theory and politics of sexuality have been fiercely contested. And she says she talks about the radical lesbian feminist critique that Sheila was talking about, and heterosexual feminists seeking to defend their sexual practices, which I suppose is a lot of that in this collection generally. And she says, like many heterosexual feminists, I find myself uneasily located between these two positions. And so she in this chapter, she sets herself this task where she says, I'm convinced of the need to analyze heterosexuality critically, to explore the ways in which it's implicated in the subordination of women, but without conflating heterosexuality as an institution with heterosexual practice, experience, and identity. So, as I say, she sets herself this task, which I didn't feel particularly optimistic about at the beginning, and I certainly wasn't very optimistic about it by the end either. Where she's what she wants to do is to separate heterosexuality as an institution from the experience of heterosexual women, their practice, experience, and identity, which seems to me, particularly as she's a sociologist, a rather tricky thing to accomplish, because usually with sociology it's about kind of making connections between all of these things and understanding that practice exists in a context, and all of that, which I'll say a bit more about on the next slide. But yeah, rather than trying to separate these two things as if they're kind of these two sort of distinct things. But it does seem to me that what she's doing is very much in line with that the kind of defense of heterosexuality and not really being rather reluctant or resistant to look at the kind of what I think are the sort of quite obvious connections. So the first part of the chapter, she does a kind of examination of what she calls three different strands of feminist perspectives on sexuality. So she begins by talking about the again the kind of things that Sheila was talking about, the lesbian feminist critique that locates heterosexuality within the context, politicizes it within the context of male domination, and analyzes, you know, all the different kind of aspects of heterosexuality through that understanding. And she says, well, that's one way of looking at it, but there are these other approaches as well. So the next perspective that she looks at emphasizes what she calls the variability and plasticity of heterosexuality, the fact that within different, you know, across time and across space, there might be particular variations and, you know, different forms that it may take. And the theorists that she uses here are Foucault and Gail Rubin. So immediately, I think, I mean, she does talk about them critically, but I wouldn't say that they're the most obvious theorists that come to mind when you're thinking about feminist perspective. So she looks at the way that both of them, again, this really follows on from what Sheila was saying, what both of them have to say about power, and can you ever really eliminate power in sexuality, you know, and all this kind of, you know, obviously both of them were great ones for the eroticization of power differences. So she doesn't talk about them uncritically, and she does kind of come back to the fact that, well, you can't look at these different variations abstracted from male domination. You know, ultimately you do have to locate them within the power structures, and so in a way she does actually, I think, whether she wants to or not, she does end up saying, you know, kind of validating the first perspective of that emphasizes male domination. And then the third perspective that she talks about is that she says that all of this emphasis on male domination, although it might be very good at looking at the links between pornography, sexual violence, heterosexuality, you know, all of these things, it doesn't really address the construction of individual desires, and, you know, how kind of individual heterosexual desire, subjectivity, you know, how that's all constructed. Although I think it does do, you know, I think these lesbian feminist theorists do a pretty good job of talking about the way in which women's sexual desire is constructed in a very kind of coercive context of the eroticization of women's subordination and submission, and, you know, all of that. So I'm not sure that she's right in suggesting that in the first place. But then within this section, she then goes on to talk about psychoanalysis, which again, because obviously there's the whole psychoanalysis the sort of terrain that it sort of treats and occupies is about construction of subjectivity and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And again, she's not uncritical of it. And she said, you know, she does acknowledge that there have been a lot of feminists, you know, very, you know, serious feminist critiques of psychoanalysis that highlight all the problems with it. But she kind of says, well, in the absence of anything else, you know, we have to, you know, we have to sort of draw on this perspective as well. So part of the chapter is that looking at these different approaches, but I really feel whether she intends to or not, she does come back to the fact that, well, you can't get away from the fact that all of this is, you know, that all of this is happening within the context of male domination. So if we can have the next slide, please, Joe. So in the sort of latter part of the chapter, she then kind of concludes, after this sort of foray into these different approaches, she concludes that that there are four aspects to heterosexuality that can all be looked at and examined and theorized. So first of all, she says, well, it's institutionalization. It occupies a place as a kind of institution within society and culture. So she's looking on that that kind of macro level. Then she says that there are the various social and political identities associated with it. And I suppose she means things like husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, all these different kinds of identities that are associated with it. And then she says another aspect is the actual practices that entails. And then finally, the subjective experience of it, how, particularly talking about women, how women experience heterosexuality. She doesn't, I think, or certainly doesn't sufficiently talk about, given the fact that it is about men and women relating, she doesn't talk about how very, very different, completely oppositionally different the practices and experiences are for men and women. I think that's, there isn't this sort of uniform experience of heterosexuality. It's because of those power differences, the experiences are as the Holland chapter shows, they're very, they're kind of polar opposites. And those have got very different kind of political consequences as well. So I think she doesn't really talk about that sufficiently. And one of the things she does touch on, that I think would probably merit a whole session in its own right, is the kind of wider scaffolding of heterosexuality. She does acknowledge that it's not just, very often in these debates, it's about sex and sexual practice, but she talks about things like marriage and domestic life and division of labor and all that kind of thing. There is another chapter in the book about that, which I was going to talk about, but I really felt I found it a very unsatisfying chapter, so I left it in the end. But I think that when we're having these debates and discussions about heterosexuality, I think we have to remember that it's not just about sexual practice, but it's about all the, everything that goes along with that, that all these kind of romantic notions that are fed to young women then end up with them doing hugely disproportionate amounts of labor in their lives, and also being, very much more at risk of exposure to, sexual violence and rape. So I think that those kinds of things are really important. But one of the things that I do think is just a pretty unconvincing aspect of this chapter is that she tries to talk about these things as separate, like saying that they can each be theorized separately. And I think that is very much about her own kind of desire to not frighten the horses, to kind of try and make heterosexual women, to sort of reassure them and make them feel okay about their position within this kind of wider heterosexual institution, because she says we need to retain a sorry, Jo, I still need that slide. I hadn't finished with it. Thanks. She says we need to retain a critical perspective on heterosexual pleasure, but one which is more subtle and less condemnatory. So it kind of, I think it seems to me she's trying to say, well, we can have some sort of critical perspective, but ultimately we don't really want to do anything about this. We certainly don't want to condemn anyone or anything. We just want to maybe talk about it, but make everyone feel okay about it. It's a very, I think in that sense, it's a very reactionary chapter. And what I was going to say about when she talks about these four aspects of heterosexuality, I do find it really strange that as a sociologist, she's trying to talk about them all separately. Because if you think about, the other big topics in sociology, like class or education, you wouldn't try to talk about education as, these institutions like schools and universities as separate from the social and political identities associated with them, or as separate from the practices that go on in those places, or as separate from the experiences within them. You would see it all as something that's very much connected, and that you don't have those experiences if there wasn't that institution. So it just seems really strange to me that a sociologist would take that approach of trying to kind of separate these things out. And I think, to me, that is reflective of a kind of resistance or defensiveness. But she does ultimately I suppose, admit, given what she's trying to do in the chapter. She says, in the final analysis, it is difficult to imagine a truly egalitarian form of heterosexuality while gender division persists. Now, gender division is one of these terrible euphemisms. I guess by that she means male domination or patriarchy or something. It's one of these awful terms that came in. But I think after all of her kind of examinations of all these different approaches and trying to separate things out, she does ultimately, if reluctantly, acknowledge the the validity of the lesbian feminist critique. So I'll hand back to Sheila there.
Thanks. Can we go to the next slide then, Jo? Okay, now my chapter in the book is called Heterosexuality and the Desire for Gender. And I describe what I think the desire for gender is here. The desire for gender, I'm meaning the power relationship between men and women, masculinity and femininity, often felt as a visceral excitement, is a crucial component of heterosexuality as a political institution. I suggest here that gender is much more than just an annoyingly arbitrary and socially constructed classification system. Feminist theorists have shown how gender dynamically empowers heterosexuality, provides its most powerful pleasures through the sexuality of dominance and submission, and maintains the cruel power of men over women through turning it into just sex. So this, I suspect, is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for many women to imagine femininity as something that could be given up, because it's so fundamental to heterosexuality, their concept of themselves within that institution, and to the understanding of what sex is. So in this chapter, I say I will seek to show how powerful the desire for gender is by looking at some examples of its effects, such as lesbian, butch, femme role-playing and transsexualism, both of which, of course, come from the desire of gender, the power relationship of gender made into sex. So can we go to the next slide, Jo? So this is my definition of femininity in this chapter, which is, of course, one half of those power relations of gender. And it's that which is seen as archetypal feminine behavior, much of which is reproduced in drag camp and transsexualism, is in fact the learnt behavior of the oppressed, learnt to avoid punishment or gain favors. It is behavior which shows awareness of low status and suitable respect for the powerful male class. Femininity is learnt behavior which is recreated every day of a woman's life through her interaction with men. Feminine behavior shows deference. And I think it's important to stress this because a couple of chapters in the book are very much saying that women's problems are created out of the early relationship with their mothers and fathers. They rely on psychology, psychoanalysts and Freud and so on. And the difference of the radical feminist perspective, I think, is that we say femininity is created every day. It's not something created under the age of 2 by how you feel about your father's penis, for instance, unless he is actually using it to penetrate you, which he may be. Your femininity is learned every single day in the ticket office at the station, by the way men look at you in the street, and so on and so on. So psychoanalysis is just a sort of an attempt to avoid and deflect and not realize the everyday reality of how femininity and women's oppression is constructed. Thanks, Jo. We go on to the next one. That heterosexual desire, this was something that a concept that I developed in the book, my book Anti-Climax, and caused consternation, I think it would be fair to say. So it's probably good to define it. I say, by the term heterosexual desire, I do not mean desire for the opposite sex, but a desire that is organized around eroticized dominance and submission. So I say that hetero, in my definition, is about difference of power. Lesbians and gay men can experience heterosexual desire too, through the reproduction of gender, through butch femme role-playing, other stylized forms of gender power difference, such as sadomasochism, or through eroticizing race, class, and age differences. Gay men in particular are very much involved often in eroticizing relationships with younger men and boys, so age difference is an important way of putting the power back in there, the heterosexual relation back in. The opposite of heterosexual desire is homosexual desire, desire based upon sameness instead of difference in power. And I do actually give heterosexual people a way out in when I'm writing about this, and saying that actually heterosexuals could potentially aim towards homosexual desire too. That is, desire based upon sameness. I'm not saying how successful they will be in getting there, but that obviously should be the goal. So I say heterosexual desire, the excitement is the excitement of cruelty, of the exploitation of inequality, but it makes its followers loyal because it's so exciting. And elsewhere, I've described heterosexual desire as the grease that oils the machinery of male supremacy. And that still seems to me a reasonable way to formulate its effect. But as you can imagine, me changing around the understanding of what heterosexual meant in this way caused some consternation, and that is addressed in other chapters in this book. If I could have the next slide, Jo. So one of the ways in which it's put back in is butch femme role-playing in lesbian relationships in the 50s, which was brought back in the 80s and was very much happening in the 90s. There were all these pornographic collections about eroticism and butch femme going on in the 90s, Joan Nessel and so on. And this is a woman describing in the 90s what butch was in the 50s, knowing how to stand on a street corner and catch a femme's eye. And femme is spotting the butch and knowing how to get her clothes off. And then at the bottom here, there were some lesbians in the 90s already sort of doing transgenderism, male imitation, and often they were involved in pornography. And this particular one was involved in pornography. If we go down to the bottom here, unfortunately, halfway into Annie Sprinkle, who was a porn model, the rod works its way through the end of the penis, and Les is forced to insert her thumb into the penile skin to give it tumescence. This is in Judith Halberstam's book. Judith Halberstam is now Jack. So the pornography, the butch femme, the transgenderism and so on were all very much mixed up together at this time and being celebrated, absolutely celebrated. These books and articles were celebrating them. So a new ingredient at the time in contemporary sexual politics, as I'm saying, there is transgenderism. It absolutely is not a new ingredient now, I think we could say, but this was 30 years ago. Okay, over to you, Julia.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to talk about chapter 9, which is quite different to the other chapters in that it draws on these two large-scale studies that took place in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. They were these two big I think they were qualitative and quantitative studies. They did a lot of interviews of young men and young women, and it was under the sort of funding stream of HIV prevention and sexual health promotion. That was sort of where the aim behind the funding came from. But what they did was ask some really, really fascinating questions to young people about their experiences of heterosexuality, and so it went way beyond the sort of messages and education about HIV prevention and sexual health in that sort of physical sense. So this chapter draws on this, and I did find it a lot more readable than a lot of the others, with the great exception of Sheila's, of course. But it included a lot of fascinating quotes from the young people that took part in their study, which I think really again, it kind of gives the line to a lot of the defensiveness of some of the heterosexual theorists who've also got chapters in the book. So this chapter is called "In the Same Boat: The Gendered Inexperience of First Heterosex," and this is where they asked people about young men and young women, specifically about their first heterosexual experience. And this title, "In the Same Boat," came from a quote right at the beginning where this young man is talking about his experience of when he first had, and when they define first sex as the young people defined it, as the first heterosexual intercourse, like penis in vagina heterosexual intercourse. That was what was understood as being the kind of the first, the defining sexual experience. Anyway, what this young man says is, you've talking about him and his sexual partner, you've got to get rid of your embarrassment, and you're both in the same boat. It's actually quite a sweet quotation. I think it's quite different to the rest of them. And what they ask in this chapter is, well, are young men and young women actually in the same boat? If they are they in different places in the same boat, or are they actually in different boats altogether when it comes to this? And so what they do in this chapter, we make the case that heterosexual first sex is an induction into adult masculinity for young men, within which the woman, whether sexually experienced herself or not, plays an ambiguous role. We are arguing that heterosexuality is not a balanced or even unbalanced institutionalization of masculinity and femininity. It is masculinity. So what they're saying is that for the young men, their experience of first heterosexual intercourse is their kind of rite of passage into adult masculinity, and it doesn't have that role for young women. Young women are just there as the kind of prop that enables young men to enter into adult masculinity, and they came to this conclusion not through just sort of their own theoretical arguments, but through analysing what the young men and the young women said about their experience. So in the next slide, we'll have a look at that. So, the first part of the chapter, next slide, please, Joe. They look at some of the interviews that they did with the young men and ask, like, how was it for him? And these are the main themes that come up. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go through these sort of quite rapidly. And probably none of these are particularly surprising, but it's quite interesting to see it sort of set out so clearly from what these young men were talking about. And most of them were aged between about kind of 16 and 19. I will just say, actually, before we look at these, if we have time at the end, I think it would be really interesting to think about, this is very much of its time. As I say, these interviews were carried out in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And if we think about some of the things that have changed quite drastically since then, obviously all the online pornography and the normalization of sexual violence is seen as very normal. Like the ideas of what constitutes sort of normal heterosexual sex, I think, have shifted quite a lot, in the intervening decade, the sort of passing decades. Anyway, but one of probably the main thing that these young men talk about is the experience of their, first heterosexual intercourse as their performance. Now, they don't necessarily always talk about it in a very, with kind of great bravado or kind of bragging, although there, is an element of that. Sometimes it might be a lot of anxiety attached to it, like, will they be able to, perform, or will they be seen as inadequate, all this kind of thing. But it's very much, their understanding of it is very much about them, their subjectivity and their performance. And that performance is so crucial because it would lead to a transition to manhood, which will mean that they will be accepted by their peers as having this kind of status of man. So it's very much a kind of, I suppose, want to use some of the jargon, a sort of homosocial experience. So what one of the young men says is, at the time, I was thinking at the time that he was actually having sexual intercourse with his sexual partner. At the time, I was thinking, if only my mates could see me now, and stuff like that. And I must admit, I didn't really think of the girl at the time. So that's, I think, a very instructive quote as to his experience of that. So something that they that comes up as well in the interviews is the significance of the talk about it. So sometimes when they're actually having that experience or doing the experience to the young woman, is that they're thinking about, oh, this is going to be something to tell my mates about, or they're really looking forward to talking about it. So it's very much about establishing their position within this kind of male group of peers as they all become men. So yeah, as I say, sex is something they do to women. They do talk about the loss of virginity. They do use some of that language, but they don't see it as a loss as such. They see it as something that is very much to be desired, as the loss of their own inexperience. That's what they want to get rid of, so that they can have this moment of agency and achievement that is very, really defining for them. And so this is what Holland and her colleagues talk about, that that the young men and the women are certainly not in the same boat. They're in very, or the very least, they're in very different positions within this boat, but their experience is actually sort of, you know, polar opposites. One of the things that they say kind of can militate against this pure kind of basic kind of like instrumentalization and usage of the woman is that if there is a level of intimacy and friendship and some kind of equality of inexperience, they both kind of acknowledge they're both inexperienced, then that can maybe place them a little bit more having that feeling of being in the same boat, but where the experience was the more impersonal and transitory the relationship was with the young woman, then the more it would just be seen as this very kind of solipsistic experience of the man kind of proving himself to himself, with the female as just being a prop. So if I can have the next slide, which analyzes the interview data from the young women. What they find is that in the women's accounts of their first experience of heterosexual intercourse, that there's no equivalent of this sort of experience as being a positive step to womanhood in the way that the men talk about it as a positive step to womanhood. And one of the things they theorize is that they say that it's not equated for the young women. This experience of heterosex is not equated with the idea of becoming a woman. And one of the things they theorize is that actually, because of the onset of menstruation, that is something that that's where young women experience this sort of transition to womanhood. That has that significance for them in a, you know, very different way to the men's experience of heterosexual intercourse as doing that. Now, I'm not entirely sure about that, because I think the certainly from what I remember from, you know, sort of peer discussions around that time, I do think there can be a real sort of shift in status for young women as to, you know, once they've had this first heterosexual experience, that maybe it shows that you're more socially successful than someone who hasn't. So I wasn't entirely convinced, but certainly that's what they found anyway in you know, in their analysis of their interviews. So the ways in which the young women talked about the experience, we can see, are really different to how the young men talked about it. They talked about it much more in terms of risk, like obviously the risk of getting pregnant, the risk of any kind of, you know, physical harm, the risk of sexual violence. And this feeling of like that they had to somehow kind of manage the experience. It was something that they had to try to manage. So obviously that potential for harm there, that was something that was very prevalent for them, as we'll sort of see in the next point. So they had, whereas the men had this sense of active power, that they were going to be able to do this thing to the woman, the young women expressed a sense of what they term negative power, that their only power they had was to kind of withhold consent, so that they might have kind of resisted and then gradually, slowly over time, cede some sort of, you know, access to the bodily territory, and then finally give consent. So I think all of these things that are coming up from what these young women are saying really bear out, you know, our understanding of heterosexuality, you know, within the context of male domination. Some of them spoke about the experience as being their a sort of price they had to pay in order to keep a boyfriend. So here's one quote: I didn't really want it. He provoked me into it, you know, it was like a one-off. You know, I didn't want it really. I just wanted someone to love at that time. He just wanted a bit of, you know. So sometimes it was seen as that kind of something that you had to do if you wanted to, you know, maintain this relationship and keep your boyfriend. So as I say, there was a lot of expression of experience of pressure, the possibility or experience of force, and this mismatch between their kind of romantic expectations that they'd been fed through the culture and then the reality of the experience. They also spoke in terms of, whereas for the men it was this kind of gaining of autonomy and subjectivity and status, for the young women it seemed there was a theme of a loss of autonomy, feeling that they'd lost themselves. The idea of virginity as something that you give to the boy, you know, as a gift. It's almost like some sort of transaction. And then there was also expression of regret within the, you know, the young women's accounts that wasn't there in the young men's accounts. I think that's me done for that chapter.
Thanks, Julia. Can we have the next slideshow? This chapter is just really, it's a repeat of what Julia was talking about when she was looking at chapter 2, the chapter by C.P. Jackson. It's a heterosexual woman trying to find a space for herself in a system which is clearly about dominance and submission, and she wants to think that she has individual agency in here. And she uses psychoanalysis to do so, so I don't really want to talk about that because I don't think it's really relevant to feminism. But just to show you what she says, my purpose in this chapter is to provide a theoretical sketch of a female sexual desire which eludes and resists patriarchal relations. And she wants to do that with men. And that's a lot easier, obviously, if you're going to leave men and be with women. But that's really all I want to say there. And she uses psychoanalysis to find her way through it. Can we just go on to the second to last slide now? That's it. Chapter 8 is by Tamsin Wilson, who's a lesbian. Which one's the man? The heterosexualization of lesbian sex. And she's really arguing mainly with me here. She's talking about revolutionary feminism, which is the tendency within feminism that I was involved in creating back in the 70s. And we did concentrate on sex and theorizing sex. She says, within this strand of revolutionary feminist discourse, heterosexual operates as a stigmatizing label. So we're sort of anti-heterosexual. Can we, and there can be no doubting the damage caused to some non-lesbian feminists by this opportunistic labeling. So us revolutionary feminists harm heterosexual women by trying to stigmatize that label, make it a nasty label for them, right? Next slide. So this is what she wants to defend here. She says the performative ritualization of some sexual practices, butch femme, SM, piercing, gender fuck, etc., is also an important social glue in certain lesbian, queer, or lesbian and gay communities, as has long been the case. So these things are very important to lesbians and to gay men. And the revolutionary feminists like me criticize them and make women feel a bit awkward about them. And that's a real problem. So we're anti-lesbian in that way. I'm anti-lesbian in that way. And she says that I've got this fundamental lack of respect for specific lesbian desires, acts, or identities, and it can make feminism appear hostile to many lesbians. So we, revolutionary feminists, put lesbians off feminism. While the relative openness of the lesbian and gay movement and the new queer activism appears far more including of lesbian diversity, it reminds me of how in the Melbourne Lesbian Action Group case, the argument of the other side, which is why men should be, pretending to be women should be in all the lesbian spaces, was they are in all of the lovely queer, lesbian and gay spaces everywhere in Australia, and they're totally accepted. Why on earth should these women want somewhere that is just for women? Well, I think that's sort of summed up pretty well in this paragraph, why we want somewhere that is just for women. And she says, and it's also the case, and this has been politically disastrous, that this attempt to eradicate the taint of heterosexuality has been done in the name of feminism. So I'm anti-feminist, I'm anti-lesbian, I'm anti-heterosexual women for wanting to engage in this thoroughgoing critique of sexuality and heterosexuality. So obviously there were some differences between me, I think it's fair to say, and Tamsin Wilson. But it's nice that she's there and at the end of that book showing the new politics that was really beginning from the 1980s to swamp academia, feminist academia, and so on, and eradicate lesbian feminism, our politics of equality, and creating an eroticizing equality that we've been creating. So I think that's it for me, sisters. Anything else that you want to say, Julia?
I just think, well, it's interesting to think about like what isn't in that book and what there is now. because obviously I was really struck in that second chapter, the Stevie Jackson chapter, that of course at that point, there was no, I know in your chapter you talk about transgenderism, but it wasn't something that they felt they even had to mention, whereas now, like where there was once at least some kind of debate and discussion about heterosexuality and the lesbian feminist critique, all of that, it's now just become, in those kind of what's taken over from women's studies, those gender studies classes, all you get now is just this endless proliferation of all these different, like Gail Rubin type sexual identities, wouldn't you? And that just becomes what everyone's talking about. It's, that is just very, very striking to think like what isn't there as as much as what is there. Yeah, I must say I enjoyed doing the having the chats with you about it, Sheila, a lot more than I my heart sank when we actually agreed, because I originally was confused and I thought we were going to do the Kitzinger and Wilkinson, which I was quite enthusiastic about, and then when I realized it was this one, my heart did kind of sink. But I think, as you say, in terms of a snapshot of the debates at the time, it's useful to go back and sort of reflect on. And it is just fascinating the way that you were just so central to, obviously you had your chapter bang in the middle of the book, but everyone else seems to be in some way or other responding to you. And so it's just that as well, I think was really fascinating. Yeah. How about you, Sheila? Any final thoughts?
Thanks, Julie. My final thoughts really in a way is that everything that's in the book obviously comes out of a movement. So there were, days and hours and huge weekends of discussion happening amongst women around all these ideas, both the ones I agree with and the ones I don't. And that's resulted in this sort of explosion of ideas that's in this book. And it's such a great shame that that doesn't exist anymore. We're not able to get together and have these discussions and create these ideas. I'm not sure whether that's going to happen again, but it is a great shame that we're not in that position now, because there's just so much in the book. There's just so much to discuss. We could
Absolutely.
have weeks of just sitting talking about the ideas that are in this book now, but that doesn't really happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, I know we need to finish. I know we're a minute over, but particularly like when I was looking at that Holland chapter with all those interviews about the first sexual experience, and you just think now of how things have gone in terms of the normalization of choking, of anal sex, just this absolute, obviously the explosion of pornography and the normalization of just the level of sexual violence that has just become this kind of what is understood as what heterosexual sex is about. I just think it is such a vindication of everything that you were saying at that time. And as you say, I think like the need to have this, the movement, not just the academic discussions, and certainly not just the academic discussions, but the women's movement discussions is like it's never been more necessary, and especially for young women. So I guess that is a challenge for all of us, isn't it? It's but anyway, here's a contribution. Hopefully if, this might be seen by a few of the young women who find themselves in that situation.
Yeah, lovely to work with you, Julia.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sheila. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.